The morning of August 7th, 1942 began with birdsong. That detail seems almost cruel in retrospect. Somewhere above the jungle canopy of Guadalcanal, above the rot and the mud, and the particular sweetness of decaying vegetation that every Marine on that island would carry in his memory for the rest of his life, birds were singing. The sun had not yet cleared the peaks of the interior mountains. The air was cool, the way tropical air sometimes is in that narrow window before the heat reasserts itself and turns the island into a furnace. On the flight line at Henderson Field, a name that meant nothing yet, but would come to mean everything, a 26-year-old Marine Corps captain named Joseph Jacob Foss was strapping himself into the cockpit of an F-4F Wildcat fighter. The Wildcat was not a beautiful airplane. It was stubby and broad, with a barrel chest and a landing gear arrangement so awkward that pilots joked it had been designed by someone who had never actually seen an airplane land. It was slow by the standards of modern fighters. Its maximum speed was just over 300 miles per hour, and its rate of climb was pedestrian compared to the aircraft the Japanese were flying against it. Foss knew all of this. He had spent enough hours in the cockpit to have no illusions about the machine he was flying. What he also knew, and what the Japanese pilots who would soon be hunting him did not fully appreciate, was that the Wildcat could absorb punishment that would have torn a Zero to pieces. It was built like a bank vault, and on this particular morning, that quality was going to matter enormously. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button, and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The campaign for Guadalcanal had begun exactly one day earlier, on August 7th, 1942, when 1st Marine Division landed on the island's northern coast in the first American offensive ground operation of the Pacific War. The strategic logic was straightforward, even brutal. The Japanese were constructing an airfield on Guadalcanal that, once operational, would give their bombers and fighters a platform from which to cut the supply lines between the United States and Australia. If that happened, the entire Allied position in the South Pacific would become untenable. The airfield had to be taken, and then it had to be held. The Marines took the airfield in the first 2 days of the landing, before the Japanese construction crews had even finished the runway. They renamed it Henderson Field, after Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator killed at the Battle of Midway 2 months earlier. Within days, the first American aircraft were operating from its coral and mud surface. Those pilots, the men who flew from Henderson Field in the weeks and months that followed, would come to be known as the Cactus Air Force, named for code word the Americans used for Guadalcanal. They would fight one of the most savage and sustained air campaigns in the history of warfare, and they would do it under conditions that stretched the limits of what human beings could endure. Joe Foss arrived on Guadalcanal on October 9, 1942, as part of Marine Fighter Attack Squadron 121, VMF 121. He was not the most decorated pilot on the island when he arrived, nor the most experienced. What he was a farm kid from Sioux Falls, South Dakota, who had grown up watching barnstormers fly over his family's fields, and who had decided, with the particular stubbornness of the rural Midwest, that he was going to fly airplanes no matter what the United States Navy thought about it. What the United States Navy had thought about it initially was not encouraging. When Foss first applied for flight training, a Navy examining board looked at his paperwork, and told him he was too old at the age of 20 to be a fighter pilot. They recommended he be trained as an observation pilot instead, which in the combat aviation hierarchy of 1940 was approximately one step above being assigned to row a boat. Foss rejected this assessment with the same quiet determination he would later bring to aerial combat. He applied again. He was accepted. He earned his wings in the spring of 1941, 7 months before Pearl Harbor changed the nature of what those wings would ask of him. By the time VMF 121 landed on Guadalcanal, the situation on the island was, to use the clinical language of military history, extremely precarious. In the plain-spoken language of the men living it, it was a nightmare. The Japanese had responded to the American landing with a ferocity that surprised even those officers who had studied their operational doctrine most carefully. They ran supply convoys down the channel between the Central Solomon Islands, a stretch of water the Americans called the Slot, almost every night, delivering men and equipment to the island under the cover of darkness while their aircraft hammered Henderson Field during the day. The Cactus Air Force flew in conditions that would have grounded most operational squadrons in any other theater. The runway at Henderson Field flooded during heavy rain and turned to gumbo that swallowed the landing gear of aircraft attempting to operate in it. The food was inadequate. The malaria rate among the ground crews was staggering. Replacement parts arrived irregularly and were hoarded with the same intensity that frontline infantrymen hoarded ammunition. Pilots who were killed or wounded were replaced slowly, if at all. The men who kept flying did so in a state of progressive physical deterioration that would have alarmed any flight surgeon not himself already suffering from the same deterioration. Into this environment, Joe Foss brought something that the men already there recognized immediately, an almost supernatural calm under pressure and a tactical instinct for aerial combat that seemed to operate independently of the fear that every honest pilot admitted was always present. His first confirmed aerial victory came on October 13, 1942, for days after his arrival, then another 3 days later, then 2 more within the week. The pace was relentless, not because Foss was seeking glory. The men who flew with him consistently described him as modest to the point of self-effacement, but because the Japanese kept coming and someone had to stop them. By late October 1942, the air battle over Guadalcanal had reached a kind of terrible crescendo. The Japanese High Command understood that Henderson Field was the key to the entire campaign. As long as American aircraft operated from it, Japanese surface ships could not move freely in the waters around the island during daylight hours, and Japanese ground forces could not be supplied and reinforced in the quantities necessary for a decisive offensive. The solution, from the Japanese perspective, was to destroy the airfield, not neutralize it temporarily, destroy it permanently. On October 23rd and 24th, they attempted to do exactly that. A massive Japanese naval bombardment on the night of October 13th had already cratered the runway and destroyed nearly half the Cactus Air Force's remaining fuel supply, forcing the Americans to drain gasoline from damaged aircraft to keep others flying. Then came the land assault, the largest Japanese ground offensive of the entire Guadalcanal campaign, aimed at overrunning Henderson Field from the south. It failed, at enormous cost to both sides, but was followed by a renewed air campaign of sustained intensity. It was in this context, in the last week of October 1942, that the engagement which would make Joe Foss famous, and which the title of this video gestures toward in a way that all good titles gesture toward truth, while leaving room for the story to complicate it, took place. The morning of October 25, 1942, 0645, Henderson Field. Foss led a flight of 8 Wildcats off the Henderson runway into gray early light, vectored by ground radar onto a Japanese formation approaching from the northwest. The formation was significant. Japanese reconnaissance had identified it as a mixed group, 0 fighters and escort, with bombers behind them. The Japanese had been flying these coordinated raids for weeks, the Zeros clearing the sky ahead of the bombers delivering their loads onto the runway, the Zeros covering the withdrawal. It was an effective tactical system, and it had worked often enough to keep the Americans in a constant state of attrition. What followed that morning was not immediately recognizable as a trap. It took days, and in some respects weeks, for the full implications of what Foss did to become clear. The radio call came in at around 0715. The Japanese formation was larger than initially reported, much larger. The radar picture was showing what appeared to be a mass raid. Estimates from the ground controllers put the incoming aircraft at somewhere between 60 and 90 planes. The 8 Wildcats of Foss's flight, which represented a substantial fraction of the airworthy fighters remaining on Guadalcanal at that moment, were facing odds of roughly 10-1, possibly worse. Standard American doctrine in late 1942, hammered into every Wildcat pilot after the brutal lessons of the early Pacific War, was clear on what you did when you face those kinds of numbers in a Wildcat. You did not engage in a turning fight with Zeros at low altitude. You used altitude and diving speed. You hit and you climbed away. You never, under any circumstances, tried out maneuver a Zero in a sustained dogfight at low altitude, because the Zero would win and you would die. What doctrine did not cover clearly, what no manual had yet been written to address, was what you did when the tactical situation itself changed in ways that made the application of doctrine a death sentence for the men you were supposed to be protecting on the ground below. Foss saw the incoming formation clearly now. The Zeros were well out in front. Flying at altitude, their position essentially advertising the location of the bombers behind them. The bombers were the objective. The runway was the target. If the bombers got through, Henderson Field might not survive it. The question of whether the Wildcat should engage the Zeros to get to the bombers, or attempt to reach the bombers directly and leave their own tails exposed to the escort, was not an academic one. It was a question with an immediate life-or-death answer. Foss made a decision that several of the pilots flying with him that morning later described, in their individual debriefings, as initially baffling. Instead of leading the flight into a climbing intercept of the Japanese formation, he turned away, not a panic turn, not a retreat in the emotional sense of that word, a deliberate, controlled banking turn that, from the perspective of the Japanese fighter pilots watching from above, looked like exactly what they expected to see when their superior numbers came into view. The Americans were running. The Zeros took the bait. The Japanese escort, seeing the American fighters apparently breaking off, did exactly what good fighter pilots do when they see an enemy in flight. They pursued. They came down off their altitude perch, accelerating into a diving chase that felt like a kill unfolding. They were fast, they were numerous, and they had every reason to believe this was going to be straightforward. It was not going to be straightforward. What Foss was doing, as he would explain later in the clipped language of the after-action report, was using the performance envelope of the Wildcat itself as a weapon. The F-4F was not faster than the Zero in level flight. It was not more maneuverable at low altitude. It could not outclimb it. What it could do, in a specific regime of flight that Foss had spent months studying both theoretically and in actual combat, was sustain energy in a dive and translate the energy into a zoom climb that the Zero, lighter, faster, but also more fragile and with less powerful engine, could not match on equal terms. The geometry of what he was setting up required the Zeros to commit to a descent. Once they came down off their altitude advantage to pursue, reversing that decision and climbing back to escort altitude would cost them time and energy. Time and energy to the bombers, now continuing on toward Henderson Field, without their escort at full strength, could not afford to give them. Foss let his flight down, apparently in retreat, for approximately 30 seconds. The Zeros followed, spreading out as they came, the way pursuit formations do when the prey appears to be fleeing rather than fighting. Then Foss pulled back on the stick. The Wildcat, heavy and graceless by the standards of the Zero, did something the Japanese pilots had not planned for. It converted that diving energy into a climbing reversal, not elegant, not quick, but effective. Foss came up inside the lead Zero's turn, inside the radius that the lighter Japanese fighter needed to track him, and fired. The lead Zero burned. What happened in the next several minutes was one of the most violent pieces of sustained aerial combat in the Guadalcanal campaign. With the Japanese escort formation now disorganized, broken from its pursuit formation into individual elements, reacting to the sudden reversal, the Wildcat pilots of Foss's flight had something that they almost never had against Zeros in anything resembling equal numbers, a series of one-on-one, high-energy conversion engagements where the specific advantages of the Wildcat, its gun platform stability, its ability to take battle damage and keep flying, its .650 caliber machine guns, could be brought to bear before the Zero pilot had time to use his own advantages. In those minutes, Joe Foss shot down 3 Japanese aircraft. Not 1, 3. His wingmen accounted for several more. The bombers, deprived of their coordinated escort, were then engaged by the remaining Wildcats, an array that had appeared on the Henderson Field radar as an overwhelming force dissolved into a dispersed, disorganized series of individual aircraft tried to complete their mission without the tactical framework that made it viable. Henderson Field was not destroyed that day, but the story does not end there. The story, in fact, was only beginning, because October 25th was not the end of the Japanese air campaign over Guadalcanal. It was the beginning of the most intense weeks of that campaign. And in those weeks, the engagement on October 25th acquired a significance that went far beyond the 3 aircraft Foss had shot down or the bombs that had not fallen on the runway. The Japanese pilots who had survived the engagement on October 25th returned to their base at Rabaul and reported what they had seen. The Americans had turned and run, and then reversed. It was noted. It was analyzed. and in the analytical framework of Japanese fighter tactics in late 1942, it was categorized as a specific thing, a defensive maneuver executed by pilots who knew they could not fight and were trying to survive rather than to win. This assessment was incorrect, but it would take weeks and dozens more aerial engagements before the cost of that incorrect assessment became fully visible. What Foss had discovered, partly by instinct and partly by the hard education of combat over Guadalcanal, was something that experienced fighter pilots from every era have recognized when they have articulated clearly. The difference between a retreat and a setup is entirely a matter of what happens next. A retreat that ends in a reversal is not a retreat. It is the first half of an attack. The psychological impact of that distinction on both the pilot executing it and the pilots on the receiving end of it was the weapon. The Japanese escort pilots who had chased them on October 25th had been flying with the confidence that comes from numerical superiority and tactical advantage. They had watched the Americans turn away and felt the specific satisfaction of a hunter watching prey acknowledge that it is prey. That feeling, that certainty, was the instrument of their own destruction. Because a pilot who believes he is in pursuit does not scan his 6 o'clock with the same vigilance as a pilot who believes he might be hunted. He leans forward into the kill, and when the kill reverses on him, there is a fraction of a second, sometimes less, when his brain has to process a reality that his expectations had not prepared him for. In that fraction of a second, Joe Foss fired. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Over the next 6 weeks, Foss flew combat missions from Henderson Field with consistency that the official records describe in the dry language of confirmed victories and dates, but that the pilots who flew alongside him described in very different terms. He was, in the words of one fellow pilot, the calmest man in a cockpit that any of them had ever seen. Not reckless, not indifferent to the danger. Calm. The way a man is calm when he understands precisely what is happening around him and has thought through, as carefully as the available time allows, what to do about it. On October 26, 1942, the day after the engagement described above, Foss shot down 4 Japanese aircraft in a single mission, a feat that made him in a single day one of the leading aces in the Cactus Air Force. On the 27th, he shot down 2 more. In November, as the naval battle of Guadalcanal raged in the waters around the island and turned the channel the Americans called Iron Bottom Sound into a graveyard of ships from both navies, Foss kept flying. He added victories in 1s and 2s and sometimes 3s. But the most important thing happening over Guadalcanal in those weeks was not the accumulating score of any individual pilot. It was something more structural, more consequential, and, in the long view of the campaign, more decisive. The Japanese Air Forces operating from Rabaul had entered the Guadalcanal campaign with a significant numerical advantage and a corps of combat experienced pilots who had been flying operationally since before Pearl Harbor, some of them since the China War of the 1930s. They were, man for man and in certain technical measures, among the finest naval aviators in the world. Their Zeros were faster, more maneuverable, and had longer range than anything the Americans could put in the air from Henderson Field. What they did not have was an inexhaustible supply of either. The pilots could not be replaced quickly. The intensive training program that had produced them, a program that prioritized the development of individual aerial combat skill over the rapid production of adequate pilots, meant that a Japanese naval aviator killed or incapacitated in the Guadalcanal campaign represented a loss of years of investment that could not be replicated in months. The Zeros could be replaced somewhat more easily, but not easily enough, and not in the face of the American industrial capacity that was, by late 1942, beginning to shift production into a higher gear. Every engagement over Guadalcanal was, therefore, a consumption of a resource the Japanese could not afford to consume at the rate the campaign demanded. And the engagements that cost them the most were not the ones in which their superior numbers and superior aircraft performance overwhelmed the Americans. Those engagements, painful as they were for the Cactus Air Force, were tactically predictable and could be, to some degree, planned around. The engagements that cost them the most were the ones they did not predict, the ones where the tactical situation reversed on them, the ones where what appeared to be a pursuit became an ambush. The ones that Joe Foss had been setting up since October 20-5th at BY the middle of November 1942. Joe Foss had 20 confirmed aerial victories. He needed 6 more to tie Eddie Rickenbacker's record of 26, the number that stood as a definitive American benchmark of individual aerial achievement from the First World War, a number that had acquired, in the 24 years since Rickenbacker had set it, the quality of a monument, something permanent. Something that defined the outer boundary of what an American fighter pilot could accomplish. The men on Guadalcanal knew about the record. The pilots talked about it the way soldiers talk about anything that gives individual achievement a frame of reference against the otherwise anonymous violence of a campaign. Foss himself, characteristically, deflected whenever anyone raised it. He said the number that mattered was not how many Japanese aircraft he had shot down, but how many American aircraft were still flying, and how many Marines were still alive on the ground below them. This was not false modesty. It was a precise statement of tactical priority. Because by November, the campaign had reached a phase where the connection between the air battle above Henderson Field and the survival of the men fighting on the ground had become nakedly, uncomfortably direct. The naval battle of Guadalcanal, fought between November 12th and 15th, 1942, was one of the most violent naval engagements of the entire Pacific War. In 3 nights of surface combat in the waters off the northern coast of the island, both navies lost ships at a rate that shocked officers on both sides who had studied naval warfare professionally for decades. The Americans lost 2 admirals killed in a single night, Daniel Callahan and Norman Scott, along with multiple cruisers and destroyers. The Japanese lost 2 battleships, including the Hai, the first Japanese battleship sunk by American forces in the war. Iron Bottom Sound earned its name in those 3 nights. The naval battle settled, at least temporarily, the question of whether the Japanese could reinforce their ground forces on Guadalcanal at the scale necessary for a decisive offensive. The answer was no. They could still run supplies down the slot in fast destroyer convoys, the runs that the Americans called the Tokyo Express. But the days of sending battleships and heavy cruisers to bombard Henderson Field into submission were over. The balance of naval power around Guadalcanal had shifted, fractionally but decisively, toward the Americans. This shift did not end the air campaign. If anything, in the weeks immediately following the naval battle, the Japanese air effort over Guadalcanal intensified. Rabaul-based Zero and bomber formations continued to push south, looking for opportunities to destroy the airfield, attrit the Cactus Air Force, and create the conditions for a ground offensive that Japanese commanders continued to plan even as a logistical basis for it eroded beneath them. It was in this environment, in the final weeks of November and the first days of December 1942, that the full significance of what Foss had been doing since October 25th became visible in the aggregate. The tactical maneuver that looked like a retreat on October 25th, the banking turn away from the incoming Japanese formation, the apparent flight to reversal, had not been a single improvised response to a single tactical situation. Foss had been refining it, adapting it, teaching it to the pilots who flew with him, building it into a repeatable system that could be applied across varying conditions of altitude, formation size, and aircraft performance. The core of the system was simple enough to state, though demanding enough to execute that most pilots could only approximate it. The Zero was a weapon optimized for a specific tactical environment, the turning dogfight at low to medium altitude, where its exceptional maneuverability and lightweight gave an advantage over heavier American fighters that was, in that specific environment, essentially insurmountable. The Zero pilot's instinct, trained into him through hundreds of hours of practice and reinforced by operational experience, was to get into that environment as quickly as possible once combat was joined. The way to defeat the Zero was therefore not to fight it in its preferred environment. The way to defeat it was to deny it that environment while creating a different one where the Wildcat's specific advantages applied. The reversal maneuver did this by exploiting the Zero pilot's own instincts against him. A Zero pilot who believed he was in pursuit naturally extended his speed and descended, exactly as good pursuit doctrine required him to. In doing so, he committed himself to an energy state and a positional geometry that, when the prey reversed, left him momentarily unable to respond effectively. The word momentarily is doing significant work in that sentence. The window of opportunity created by the reversal was measured in fractions of seconds, not minutes. Executing it successfully required that Foss, or whatever pilot was leading the maneuver, make the reversal at precisely the right moment, with precisely the right amount of energy in the aircraft, in precisely the right position relative to the pursuing Zero. Too early and the Zero could respond before it had fully committed to the pursuit. Too late, and the Wildcat would be out of energy when it needed to convert the reversal into a firing solution. Foss had been flying combat missions from Henderson Field for 6 weeks by mid-November. In those 6 weeks, he had developed an intuitive understanding of the reversal timing that his debriefs could only partially capture in language. He knew, in the way that skilled practitioners of any physical discipline know, when the moment was right. The knowing lived in his hands, in his inner ear as much as in his conscious mind. The pilots who flew on his wing described it consistently. There would be a moment when everything seemed wrong, when the Japanese formation was too large, too close, too fast, when the sensible thing was obviously to keep running and try to survive rather than reverse and try to fight. And then Foss would pull back on the stick, and what seemed like certain death would resolve, in the space of a few hundred feet of sky, into a firing solution. The Japanese pilots facing him over Guadalcanal in October and November of 1942 were not inferior aviators. Several of them were veterans of Pearl Harbor and Midway. They had been flying combat operations continuously since December 7, 1941. Their accumulated experience was measured in things that flight training cannot fully provide: the ability to read a developing aerial situation, to feel the geometry of a fight before it becomes explicit, to anticipate rather than react. What they cannot fully account for, what their experience had not, until Guadalcanal, given them a framework for, was an American pilot who used their own superior skill against them. The reversal worked partly because of Foss's precise execution of it. It worked equally because the Zero pilot pursuing him was good enough to be dangerous in a conventional tail chase, which meant he was committed enough to the pursuit to be vulnerable when it reversed. A less experienced Japanese pilot might have broken off the pursuit earlier, less certain of his advantage, and avoided the trap. The best Japanese pilots died in it. This was the deep irony of the Guadalcanal air campaign that the title of this video reaches toward. The Japanese air forces were, by almost every technical and individual measure, superior to the Americans they were fighting in the first year of the Pacific War. Their aircraft were faster and more maneuverable. Their pilots were more experienced. Their doctrine was refined by years of actual combat. And yet it was precisely those advantages, the confidence they generated, the instincts they shaped, the tactical habits they reinforced, that made the pilots who held them vulnerable to a man who had spent 6 weeks learning exactly how those advantages expressed themselves in a turning fight over Jungle Island. Foss did not beat the Japanese by being better than them in the ways they expected to be beaten. He beat them by being different in a way they had not planned for. On November 19, 1942, Foss's 23rd aerial victory was confirmed, followed by his 24th 3 days later. The record was close enough now that it was impossible for anyone on Guadalcanal to pretend not to be watching. The Japanese, meanwhile, were watching something else: the rate at which their experienced pilot corps was being depleted. The operational records from Rabaul for this period show a command increasingly concerned not just with tactical outcomes on individual missions, but with the sustainability of the air campaign itself. Experienced section leaders were being replaced by pilots with less time in type and less combat experience. The quality of individual aerial marksmanship was declining. Formations that had once operated with a fluid coordination of well-drilled teams were beginning to show the seams of organizations trying to replace irreplaceable men with available ones. The Americans were experiencing their own version of this problem. The Cactus Air Force was chronically short of pilots, parts, and flyable aircraft. The malaria rate continued to climb. Men who had been flying combat missions for 2 and 3 months were operating on reserves of physical and psychological endurance that flight surgeons, had they been frank, would have described as dangerous. Several pilots were removed from flight status not because they had been shot down, but because their hands would not stop shaking on the ground after they landed. Foss himself was not immune to this. The after-action reports and the recollections of men who flew with him in November describe a pilot who was visibly thinner than he had been on arrival, who slept when he could and ate what was available, which was often not much. He had been strafed, hit by anti-aircraft fire, and forced to make emergency landings on Henderson's torn and flooded runway more times than the official record fully captures. What the record does capture is the outcome. On November 19th, 23rd, and 25th of 1942, Foss added victories that brought him to 26, tying Rickenbacker's record. The 26th aerial victory was confirmed on January 15, 1943, after a period in which Foss had been medically evacuated from Guadalcanal with malaria, so severe that the flight surgeon who examined him on his arrival at the Rear Area Hospital initially doubted he had been flying combat missions in his condition. He recovered, returned to the campaign, and flew the mission on which his 26th victory was confirmed. The record was tied, and then, on January 15th, he exceeded it. His 26th confirmed aerial victory made Joe Foss the leading American ace of the Second World War at that point in the conflict. His total of 26 victories remains, to this day, tied for the highest score of any Marine Corps aviator in the history of American military aviation. The Medal of Honor recommendation, submitted by his commanding officer and approved to the Marine Corps chain of command, cited not just the number of victories, but the quality of leadership Foss had demonstrated over the Guadalcanal campaign. The pilots who had flown on his wing came home. The pilots who had learned the reversal maneuver from watching him execute it came home. The survival rate among the men who flew in his formations was, by the brutal mathematics of Guadalcanal, remarkable. President Franklin Roosevelt presented Foss the Medal of Honor at the White House on May 18, 1943. Foss was 28 years old. He was, according to the citation, recognized for distinguished gallantry and intrepidity above and beyond the call of duty as Executive Officer of Marine Fighter Attack Squadron 121 in action against enemy Japanese forces. But the citation's formal language cannot fully capture what had actually happened over Guadalcanal in those months. What had happened was this. A farm boy from South Dakota had arrived on a malaria-ridden island in the South Pacific with an airplane that was outclassed by its primary opponent in almost every performance category that fighter pilots use to measure such things, and had proceeded to destroy 26 Japanese aircraft by finding and exploiting the one thing his opponents had that could be turned against them, their confidence. The Japanese pilots who chased Joe Foss when he turned away were not making a mistake in any conventional sense. They were doing exactly what their training, their experience, and their tactical doctrine told them to do. They were applying advantages that were real. They were pressing an attack that, by any reasonable assessment of the situation, should have succeeded. What they could not know, what no amount of skill or experience could have told them the fraction of a second before Foss pulled back on the stick, was that the man they were chasing had already decided where they were going to be when he reversed. He had read the pursuit before they had completed it. He had seen the geometry of the trap while they were still walking into it. This is the thing about the story that the title gestures toward when it uses the word coward. The label is wrong, obviously. Joe Foss was not a coward, but the misidentification is not random. It describes something real about the nature of what he was doing. A pilot who turns away from a fight, and a pilot who is setting up a reversal look identical from outside the cockpit. The difference is entirely internal. It lives in the intention, in the calculation, in the three-dimensional spatial awareness that tells one pilot where the geometry of the next 5 seconds is going to resolve. The Japanese pilots who called a retreat, and the after-action reports from Rabaul suggest that some of them did, in exactly those terms, in the weeks before the pattern became too costly to ignore, were not wrong about what they saw. They were wrong about what it meant. By the time they understood the difference, the campaign had turned. The air forces that had entered the Guadalcanal campaign with numerical superiority and technical advantage had been ground down, attrited engagement by engagement, to a shadow of their opening strength. The experienced pilots were gone. The Zeros were still fast, still maneuverable, still technically formidable. But the men flying them in February of 1943 were not the men who had flown them in August. They were younger, less experienced, and, most critically, they had inherited a tactical problem their predecessors had not solved: how to fight an enemy who used your own aggression against you. The Japanese formally evacuated Guadalcanal on February 7th and 8th, 1943, removing their remaining ground forces in a night operation the Americans did not detect until it was complete. The island was secure, Henderson Field, the airfield that had been the objective of the entire campaign, remained in American hands. The slot that the Tokyo Express had run for months was no longer a viable supply route. The strategic initiative in the South Pacific had shifted permanently to the Americans. None of this was solely the result of what happened in the air above Henderson Field. The campaign was decided by the sum of countless actions on land, at sea, and in the air over 6 months of sustained, brutal fighting. But the air campaign was the spine of it. As long as Henderson Field functioned, the Japanese could not use the waters around Guadalcanal freely during daylight. As long as the Cactus Air Force flew, the Japanese ground forces could not be supplied at the scale their offensive required. And the Cactus Air Force flew, in significant part, because men like Joe Foss found ways to fight effectively against an enemy that was, by almost every individual measure, their superior. After the war, Foss returned to South Dakota. He served as governor of the state from 1955 to 1959. He was the first commissioner of the American Football League. He served on the board of the National Rifle Association. He lived a long, public, distinctly American life that bore very little outward resemblance to the 23-year-old farm kid strapping himself into a battered Wildcat on the Henderson Field flight line before sunrise. But the thing he had done over Guadalcanal, the specific insight about the relationship between appearance and intention in aerial combat, between what a maneuver looks like and what it actually is, that did not belong to any particular era or any particular war. It described something permanent about the nature of conflict, about the way that genuine advantage is sometimes invisible until the moment it ceases to be. The best trap is one that looks like a retreat. The best ambush is one that begins with the ambusher apparently running. The pilot who turns away and the pilot who is already 3 moves ahead look identical until the reversal. And by the time the reversal happens, the question of what to call it, courage or cowardice, retreat or setup, has already been answered by the trajectory of burning aluminum falling toward the sea below. Joe Foss died on January 1st, 2003, in Scottsdale, Arizona, at the age of 87. He was buried with full military honors. His Medal of Honor citation hangs today in the National Museum of the Marine Corps in Triangle, Virginia, alongside the records of men who flew with him over Guadalcanal in those months when the outcome of the Pacific War was still genuinely uncertain. The F-4F Wildcat he flew is no longer in production. The tactics he refined were incorporated into the training doctrines that shaped the next generation of American fighter pilots, and the generation after that. The specific maneuver, the banking turn away, the apparent retreat, the precise reversal, became one of the foundational elements of the energy maneuverability theory that would, 20 years later, transform the way every Air Force in the world trained its pilots. All of it traces back, in some measure, to a morning over Guadalcanal in October 1942, when a farm kid from Sioux Falls looked at a formation of zeros and decided that the most effective thing he could do was turn away and then turn back. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.